Framing the Arctic, a cross-national comparative news analysis of the National Post and RT by Harvin Bhathal. So originally I was doing this research paper on 4 countries of the 9 countries that are relevant to this issue. This figure lists Denmark via Greenland, Russia, Canada, Norway, and the US via Alaska, but the other countries include Sweden, Iceland, Finland, and China. Yes, the same China that is over 1,500 kilometers away from the Arctic Circle, which I'll expand upon later. I settled on Canada and Russia because they have the 2 biggest territorial claims, and they claim sovereignty over 2 new potential shipping routes in the summer months. So while I will still mention China and the US in my discussion as they're prominent actors in the sample, this case study will focus on Canada and Russia. Now on to the crux of the issue. As global temperatures continue to rise, ice shelves melt, become thinner and weaker, and eventually they break off from the mainland. This has led to sea level rise that, if it continues at this rate, it will submerge entire cities, states and provinces, and even countries across the globe. While those concerned about the climate crisis have seen this mass exodus of ice from ice shelves in the Arctic as a potentially catastrophic event, others have seen how to make a profit. The climate crisis is opening up the Arctic's waters that were formerly ice-locked, and combined with technological advances and declining stocks and global resources, the region is becoming more accessible and more important than ever. More specifically, what are becoming accessible are massive oil and gas reserves and newfound access to shipping routes, hence profit. According to the US Geological Survey, an estimated 13% of the world's undiscovered oil reserves and an estimated 30% of Earth's untapped natural gas lays beneath the seabed under the Arctic Ocean, and also an abundance of rare earth elements such as uranium, gold, and diamonds. The Northwest Passage, one of the 2 new shipping routes, primarily concerns Canada and the US, but it has also led to disputes with China, Russia, and Denmark as well. It threads through Canada's northern islands and will continue to grow in size and accessibility as global temperatures increase. The rights to its use are disputed as Canada claims the passage as a part of its internal waters, while countries such as the US, China, Russia, and Denmark view it as an international strait. The other new shipping route is the Northern Sea Route, which primarily concerns Russia and China. Russia is way ahead in terms of its infrastructure and the amount of icebreakers it has in the Arctic, as its coastline accounts for 53% of Arctic Ocean coastline. Russia is already using it to ship to Europe in the summer months, and China is interested in it being an international strait because it would reduce the distance by sea between East Asia and Europe by 40%. So news coverage has focused on these aspects, but an important part of this issue that is missing in news coverage is how indigenous peoples living in these regions will be affected. There are questions of if this newfound accessibility will lead to their displacement, a displacement that has already taken place in other regions in these countries. Based on the history of anti-indigenous policies in these countries, the Arctic is simply land, internal waters, territorial sea, exclusive economic zones, and international waters, not the home of indigenous peoples that have been living in these areas for thousands of years. How the Arctic is divided today stems from the United Nations Convention for the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS for short, which came into force in 1994. UNCLOS determined the extent of a country's claim to a territorial sea of 12 nautical miles, which is 22 kilometers, and a continental shelf of 200 nautical miles, which is 370 kilometers, from the extent of its territorial sea. And upon ratification of UNCLOS, there is a 10-year period for a country to submit a claim for an extended continental shelf. Canada and Russia have ratified UNCLOS. The US has signed the convention but has yet to ratify it, and China does not have any legal territorial claim in the Arctic. However, they, along with other countries, have rights to activities such as scientific research, fishing, rights to resource exploitation, and more in the Arctic, which is pursuant to treaties such as UNCLOS, the Spitsbergen Treaty, and general international law. China is including the Arctic in their Belt and Road Initiative, calling it the Polar Silk Road, and because China is the largest exporter of goods in the world and 90% of world trade is moved by sea, this could have a significant impact on the global economy. One specific area of contention is the Lomonosov Ridge, which is the dark blue figure in this image. Rights to the ridge will allow a country to include an additional 150 nautical miles of seabed rights. Russia, Canada, the US, Denmark, and Norway have all submitted claims to it, and it's yet to be determined who it will belong to, if anyone. So the method I'm using is a mixed inductive and deductive method using framing theory and media systems theory. And those methods are shown in my research questions. How does each news outlet frame issues about the Arctic, and how does the media system of each news outlet connect to the framing of the issues? The Arctic is being presented as an area of serious geopolitical concern when, instead, it's an example of a maritime space where states have settled disputes before real conflict could emerge, and have used a framework of agreed boundaries as a basis for transboundary cooperation. The concept of securitization in security studies follows that it is by labeling something a security issue that it becomes one. By framing the territorial claims and access to resources as a conflict, it is seen by those who consume the news, whether indirectly or directly, as conflict. It brings into question what the media systems are in these countries. Hallen and Mancini developed a theory of organizing the different media systems through 4 dimensions. Canada follows a liberal model, which is characterized by a relative dominance of market mechanisms and of commercial media. There's low political parallelism, high professionalization in journalism, although that is becoming more under question, and low state intervention. But the scope of their book was primarily the Western world, where the proposed models were not as applicable to countries such as Russia. Through my own research, I found that Russian media finds itself sharing elements of both the democratic corporatist model and the polarized pluralist model, which were depicted in the last slide. Because Russia's political system is a bureaucratic, authoritarian regime, influenced by the role of political industrial clans and conglomerates, which refers to the presence of technocrats, big business, and the Kremlin in their bureaucracy, their media system can be labeled as the polarized corporatist model. So I'm not going to go deep into my methods or the results from my methods because that could take up this entire presentation. But regarding the frames, the inductive frames are created where nationalism, environmental impact, and Arctic is the land of indigenous Inuit peoples. The nationalism frame is about an article being written in the perspective of the country the news outlet resides in, whether or not it praises the government of its country, and if it is critical of other countries who are competing with its country on these issues. The environmental impact frame is about an article referring to the climate crisis as the reason behind melting ice in the Arctic, and whether or not it refers to the melting ice as being inherently negative, and if it refers to the environmental impact of overexploiting resources. The Arctic is the land of indigenous and Inuit peoples frame is an article referring to the impacts of melting ice on them, whether or not it refers to the impacts of shipping and resource extraction operations on them, and if the article refers to them as a hurdle to these operations. And I took the deductive frames from a study by Semetko and Valkenburg. A conflict frame relates to the concept of securitization that I briefly touched upon earlier, and an economic frame is self-explanatory. So my sample was 20 articles each from National Post and RT, which can be considered as right-wing media outlets. The time period was between December 1st, 2017 and December 1st, 2020. What I deciphered from the results of my analysis is that the nationalism frame is found much more in RT articles, which connects to media systems theory because RT is state-controlled media. And although RT acknowledges the impacts of the climate crisis in the Arctic and presents themselves as viewing it as inherently negative, they don't acknowledge the impact of overexploiting natural resources such as oil and natural gas, even with 2 oil spills in 2020. And that's because Russia gets 90% of its gas and 60% of its oil from the Arctic. Also, National Post is much more critical of the Canadian government than RT is of the Russian government, which speaks to the fact that the current Canadian regime is center-left, which is debatable, and National Post is a right-wing media outlet. And the lack of numbers for the Indigenous and Inuit peoples frame is relevant because it reinforces the truth that issues related to Indigenous peoples are in the back front of right-wing media, let alone general mainstream media. And these are my references. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.